Hi, I'm Aury and I attended Pace University's musical theater program from 2012 to 2016. I knew that I wanted to perform from a wee age. My parents were super supportive, very hands-on. They enrolled me in voice lessons from the age of 9, and I attended a ton of extracurricular programs for young kids who wanted to explore theater as a creative outlet. I was a very obnoxious child, really overly enthusiastic, zeal on fleek. And I think it was the only way that I felt like I belonged somewhere. I grew up in a very white neighborhood, a small suburb just outside of Philadelphia. Felt very closed in by the constructs that existed within those communities and didn't necessarily feel as though who I was growing into become as I grew into becoming an autonomous adult, there was not necessarily the resources to nurture that type of young spirit when I was in my formative years. But the one thing that I always felt, where I felt home, where I could thoroughly express myself was in the theater. And when I was singing, I had trouble. I was bullied a lot as a kid. I was super weird, very, couldn't control my energy necessarily. So I found that the only place where like that was even remotely celebrated or nurtured was within the theater community. So I always loved it. I never thought I wanted to do anything else. In my first grade yearbook, I think I wrote that I wanted to attend Juilliard for opera, be on Broadway by the time I was 21. Hasn't happened. And I said I would go to Juilliard or University of Pennsylvania for musical theater. They don't have a BFA in musical theater. It's where my dad went. But I had plans from the age of probably about 6. And my dad was very invested in preparing me for college from like as young as you can kind of start your kid. As soon as I could start college programs, he enrolled me in the summer. And obviously my mother was also very supportive. But he did all this research. He was constantly on College Confidential. He was very invested in finding the right program for me. And we had this idea of like what I felt like I needed. I wanted a BFA. I didn't want a BA. I wanted comprehensive acting training that wasn't vague, that was integrated with other acting majors, which was something that I was promised before I went to PACE, which did not end up happening. And I wanted to obviously go to a school with a little bit of prestige. And initially I hadn't thought of PACE as that school. I hadn't done a ton of research. I didn't know very much about it. It was a very young program, but fundamentally when I went there was this energy of inclusivity and very deep love and caring in a way that I didn't experience at a lot of my other college auditions. I did like 12 college auditions because I auditioned for musical theater and opera schools. So I had a vast array of experiences during my senior year when I was auditioning, and I met this incredible person, Brandon Contreras, when I auditioned at PACE, and I'll still remember that, how much I just felt there was a familial energy to him and also to other folks that were there working the auditions. And there was something warm and inviting that felt just kind of right. And Amy and Bob, when I first met them, they were very invested in me. They were very complimentary. They were pretty supportive. And I felt that in exploring all of these different schools that I wanted to attend, I had narrowed it down to 3 schools by the time I had to choose. And one was Carnegie Mellon for opera. One was NYU's musical theater BFA, and one was PACE. Both of my parents, my dad wanted me to go to Carnegie Mellon, and my mom wanted me to go to NYU. And for some reason, I didn't send a no email to PACE. I had, declined the other schools, and Amy Rogers sent me an email and said, hey, if you don't respond to me, I'm going to give your slot away to somebody else. And I immediately sent her this like totally verbose, insecure response of like, I'm so sorry. It's really hard for me to make this decision. This is where I'm at. I think I need a little bit of help. Can you provide some insight as to why you think this program is best for me? And she immediately responded and said, "Hey, Aury, you know, I think that the only way for you to really understand why this is the place that you ought to be is to come and have an in-person visit. Also, to have a female head of a department was very exciting to me. I was not yet openly gay, and Amy was this, you know, successful lesbian woman that I admired, and I so craved that experience of having mentorship from people who have cultivated a life that they can be proud of as an openly gay person. That was definitely subconsciously very attractive to me in choosing Pace. Yeah, I think when I went and we had this meeting, she just had all of the right answers. You know, it was so personal in a way that no other school was personal. She seemed very deeply invested in me as an individual, not as a part of a class, not as, you know, a ticked box, which is painfully ironic. But yeah, I think she had me fooled. She had a lot of folks fooled. She'll say all the right things and make you feel very deeply loved. I thought that this was the school that was going to arm young, diverse talent to go out into the world and navigate it in a way that was going to change it. And that's what I thought when I arrived at Pace. So I returned from my visit, and I told my parents, you know, I have to go with my gut. I can feel it. This woman wants me so bad, and she's going to be so invested in what I have to offer. And I'm still discovering all of the things that I have to offer and what I'm passionate about, and like how I want to channel my artistic drive. Initially, I had asked her actually to speak to my parents on the phone, to convince them, and so they could understand why this woman was so influential in my decision. So I had her personal phone number, and I called her, and because I couldn't wait, I didn't want to leave a voicemail, and I was so eager. I think I was one of the last people to fill in the final class. And I called her and I said, "Hey, like, you were right. I needed to come here to see it. Let's like leap of faith. Let's fucking do it." You know? Yeah. And I mean, I was so excited. I remember when I got to my orientation, I met Alex and man, we were so excited. It felt like, you know, it felt like a new beginning that our generation specifically was so ready for. Our generation of artists. Coming to a place where we were made a promise that we would be celebrated for the beautiful, unique, vibrant, everything that we had to bring to the table. We were so ready. We were ready to excuse anything in the name of gaining access to some type of ownership over who we were. And the really screwed up part of all of this is that in certain ways, we were granted access to ourselves as individuals by this white woman. And for that reason, we regarded her with these wide eyes and these open hearts and this burning desire to unlock something that we knew was inside of us. And unfortunately, we mistook her enthusiasm, what seemed like enthusiasm in the beginning, this desire to celebrate who we were as individuals. We mistook racism and severe bias and patterns of practice rooted in fetishization and commodification and tokenism. And we saw those as the golden opportunities to represent our communities on a stage that was provided by and crafted for white producers and white audiences and white consumption. My class was like so beautifully diverse in a way I had never seen any other BFA musical theater class. And we all were in on that. We were all eager to celebrate that. We were eager to celebrate each other and lift each other up in a way that we had never experienced before, because so many of us did come from predominantly white communities, that instill in you that theater is an art form intended for white folks and white consumption, more importantly. And Amy promised to celebrate each of us and what we have to offer as individuals, beyond what any stereotype may frame for us, or what has previously been carved out for us. We believed that we were there to carve out a new space for people like us. And my class in particular was extremely powerful in terms of energies and passions. Some of the most passionate people I've ever met are in the class of 2016. And I am very, very proud of a lot of those folks. And I'm devastated to know that they came in so eager to create this world that we all wanted to share in together and push the envelope. And I think we let quite a bit slide. Obviously, we operated under this frame of mind of necessary endurance, of mistreatment, commodification, fetishization, leaning into exoticism of non-white bodies. And that particularly became very clear to me within my first semester at Pace. One of the first shows that we auditioned for was Ryan Scott Oliver's Jasper and Deadland. It was a reading that would happen in the fall, through the winter, I believe the fall of my first semester at Pace, and that would have been 2012. And I just turned 18 that September, and we went in, we auditioned. We were all very eager. We came out very strong. There were a number of freshmen that were cast in this reading in what I understand as an unprecedented way. And I was very fortunate to be afforded an opportunity to play a lead in Ryan's show. And Ryan was teaching us freshman music theory at the time, and on the following theory class, I believe, after our auditions and after we had received the cast list, Ryan took it as an opportunity to offer a little bit of insight as to what happens behind the table, and publicly discuss within our classroom why each individual was either cast or was not cast. And when he arrived at me, he said I had a strong audition. He said I sang opera for the audition because he said he wanted bold choices. And I said, this is something I know how to do very well. Let me see if he digs it. It worked. He said, Aury sang Carmen, and I really liked that. I was like I love that she made that choice. And I also, when I imagined this character that I wrote of Persephone, I imagined her to just have big porn star tits. And I don't even think I thoroughly processed the implications behind a white gay man objectifying my body, my freshly 18-year-old body, to a classroom full of my peers, and to indicate that part of the reason why I was afforded the opportunity was because he looked at me and sexualized me innately, and knew that other people would sexualize me. And I also remember Ryan talking a lot about the necessity of being fuckable in classroom settings. A number of teachers articulated that to us from a very young age. And that I would be sexualized throughout my entire experience at Pace, by a number of different faculty members, by directors, by Amy. And it's also important to address the implications of sexualizing Asian women, especially as a white man. Of course, that's how their brains work. We innately sexualize women of color in general, especially, no, all women of color, really. And we have trouble imagining, for example, Asian women outside of narratives that are existing to either be fucked or physically harmed, or left behind by a white man. So I didn't see any other options, and I decided to move forward, enduring that, understanding that this had to be an asset to me rather than something that I could call out and hopefully eradicate for the next person. Moving throughout the rest of my time at Pace, in general, it just became an increasingly more hostile environment for people of color. Eventually, Amy held a meeting for our class and labeled us as a fractured unit and told us that it was now our job, the people who each individual was paying around $250,000 for this education, that it was our job to fix the issue with the faculty, and to figure out how we were going to move forward in a productive way. Even after all of that discussion, even after Amy asked each of us to write her letters as individuals to detail our perspectives and our experiences, still nothing changed, because we were still looking to a higher power at this. Everybody who held power within the faculty was white, and there were no resources for them to better understand the young, brilliant, malleable minds that they were there to help and prepare for the industry. And by my senior year, I was still dealing with the same issues. Bob Klein assigned me a number of Latinx roles. He assigned me a number of roles that I have no interest playing, roles that there was no consent, especially surrounding roles that might be problematic or roles that might come from shows where maybe certain people that come from that diaspora are not necessarily comfortable exploring that narrative that was clearly shaped by white people. For example, I was assigned Bloody Mary from South Pacific, which is I will not play that role for many years if I so choose to play that role. I will never choose to play that role because I find it to be problematic. But not only was I assigned this, but a white student in my class was also assigned this role. A number of us were offered racially inappropriate materials, and there was this pressure to come in prepared. And we had already made this big stink about how we needed our voices to be heard. So at a certain point, we felt as though perhaps there were battles that we needed to choose. Perhaps we needed to swallow it down and just do the work. And performance opportunities at Pace were the most coveted opportunities, of course, because how can you understand how to practice your craft if you don't literally practice it in school? It is undeniably necessary to have performance opportunities in a BFA program. The classroom is is the amended version of a performance opportunity where a lot of the work is on you to do as an individual at home, to prepare, to bring in, to present. Whereas when you are working on a show together, it's extremely collaborative. You have opportunities to work with directors, try on a lot of different things that you don't necessarily have the time to practice when you're in a classroom setting. So it is a very necessary aspect of learning how to be an artist. I was afforded a number of opportunities, performance opportunities. During my time at Pace, I performed almost every semester, with the exception of my senior year. And the first main stage show that I performed in was Dogfight by Pasek and Paul. And Dogfight is about a group of Marines who are about to ship off to the Vietnam War. And on their last night in San Francisco, they throw a party called the Dogfight where they all participate in a contest to figure out who can bring the ugliest date to the party. And the person who brings what is regarded by a group of men as the ugliest woman is awarded with a cash prize and clout. Why you would want to do that show with a group of young artists who you claim to celebrate as individuals and misfit toys and unique perspectives is lost on me. But Amy was very eager because we were the first production outside of the initial off-Broadway production, and certainly the first in New York. I didn't initially audition for Dogfight because the sides, the material that they had sent out for the women was, well, you could sing one of two songs from the show. Each of them are extremely high, as you may be able to hear in my speaking voice. I don't really sing that high. So I didn't choose to audition for it. I felt that there were other people that I knew, my peers, who would be better suited to occupy that space, to get that opportunity. And Amy's stage manager reached out to me via Facebook Messenger and said, "Hey, are you coming to Dogfight auditions today?" I said, "Oh, no. I didn't see a part for me in the show." And the stage manager said, "Well, Amy would really like for you to come in and audition. She was really hoping you'd show up today." And of course, I just finished my first year of college, and I was so flattered that the head of the department was like, "I want to make sure that Aury is going to be in this show." So I run down. I'm completely ill prepared in terms of dress, appearance. All audition etiquette was completely off the board for me for this particular audition. And Amy brought me in, and I sight read a couple of lines, sung them through a few times. I'd never seen the music before. I maybe read a couple of lines, and Amy said, "You know what, that's perfect, that's great, thank you so much." And I was cast. Didn't even show up to the audition. Was called in by Amy out of nowhere. Didn't know anything about the show, and it was immediately cast. And I'm going to tell you exactly why. There were two tracks in the show, two female ensemble tracks that played a number of roles throughout the play. In the initial breakdown, there was one that played the mother of the main character, a librarian, I believe, and this character called Ruth Two Bears. The other character was supposed to play a hippie, a sex worker named Chippy, and I can't quite recall the other roles. This is how the initial published breakdown, how it was received by us in our emails from Amy. And when we got the cast list, those roles were a little bit shifted around and rearranged so that I was going to play the characters of Ruth Two Bears and the sex worker Chippy with a number of non-speaking cameos, I think. And that immediately made it clear as to why I was so necessary to this production. Ruth Two Bears is described in the breakdown as stoic, deadpan, Native American. And there were no, at that point in when I was attending Pace, I believe, The only Indigenous person I knew of who attended PACE during my time there had already graduated. And I was what Amy imagined to be the closest thing to passing as Indigenous. And Ruth Two Bears was an incredibly offensive role to play. She sat there with a double chin, extreme, hyper-masculine, spoke with a deep voice to portray this idea of ugliness and masculinity and gruffness. And I did that for her because I felt chosen. But the more problematic, believe it or not, role that I had to play in this show was Chippy the sex worker. She doesn't have a ton of lines. She exists within one of the big numbers in the show, one of the most iconic numbers, Hometown Hero, where the Marines are all getting riled up about how excited they are to eventually come home as heroes to their country and to be celebrated. And my character shows up because one of the Marines is bent upon losing his virginity before he goes to war, and that was the role that I was going to be there to fulfill. When we were discovering how we were going to examine all of these characters, Amy called me into her office. We had a little bit of a discussion. How are we going to approach each of these people honestly and best serving the narrative and best serving the story? And we got to this character, Chippy, the sex worker. And I said, you know, what, do we have any ideas? And she's like, I think you know, like she never quite said any direction out loud. And eventually I came to the understanding, I said, oh, you'd like me to try it with some type of Asian dialect. And she's like, I think it might really serve the story. So, you learn from a very young age as an Asian kid or any kid of an immigrant with somebody who speaks with an accent that like a really quick, easy, cheap laugh for white people especially is some type of accent, making fun of us, for me as an individual, an Asian accent. And it's never taken seriously in the theater. The only way that this has been used as a storytelling tool is as a butt of a joke. I've never seen a serious musical where an accent is used to honor somebody's truth. It has only ever been there as a source of comedy for white consumption. And I knew that this would get me a lot of laughs. This would make me maybe a little bit more palatable, a little bit more approachable, making white people feel comfortable with me being able to create this joke for them to consume. So we went in. We tried the accent in the read-through with Pasek and Paul, and we couldn't make it through the scene. Everyone was absolutely rolling on the floor, essentially laughing. I couldn't make it through. I was laughing through it. I was deeply uncomfortable. And eventually we moved on without the accent. And then I think, retrospectively, I examine it, and I think, of course, Amy chose to ensure that I would be the one to play a character who is portraying a sex worker. And of course, she would find it necessary to the narrative to make it so that I am not necessarily American, because Americans have this discomfort with the idea of being responsible for sex work historically, right? And this is an easy way to hypersexualize me and additionally tokenize me and distance me from the American narrative. And in the show, the character doesn't want to have sex with the Marine. She says, I've had a long day. That's it for me. Tough luck. Sorry, go find somebody else. And a group of Marines come in and incite violence against her and push her to the ground. That was choreographed by Amy. And so she is physically and violently intimidated into having sex with this white man after saying no. A direct violation of any type of consent. And she agrees. and you never see her again. You don't know she goes behind a wall in the set, and the next thing you see is the white man coming out, fist in the air, and his line is, "I'm a goddamn hero." This big moment, the peak of the song is him celebrating that he lost his virginity by sexually assaulting a non-consenting Asian woman. And we never even talked about it. That's the really wild part, is there was no checking in to see, how do you feel safe? Do you feel, let's talk about the implications of this violation of consent. Let's discuss how we treat female-bodied people and how we make people feel safe. It was almost as if it should become as second nature to all of us to understand that this is simply how the dynamics work. And this character isn't there for any other reason as to provide this very quick obstacle to the objective of this character to lose his virginity. And the tactic was to incite violence against her and bully her into engaging in sex with him. And then you never get a follow-up. You never know if she's okay. She could have died. That wasn't a question that Amy asked. She didn't care. She only cared about the white students. The following semester, I was offered another performance opportunity to play the role of Erzulie in Once on This Island. Once on This Island, it takes place in Haiti. It was originally performed, as it should always be, by an all-Black cast. And when Amy and Bob wanted to discuss with our general student body as to how this show was going to be cast, they came in, they were very uncomfortable and thoroughly unprepared to discuss with us what racially exclusive casting is. And certainly hadn't asked any advice of maybe somebody who could provide a little bit of insight as to how to play into those sensitivities, or to be mindful of the people who really deserve to be afforded these opportunities, even to be a part of a show that is written for Black people by white people, which is in itself inherently problematic and a fatal flaw of our industry. But when they offered us this information, they said, we've decided that everyone in the show, with the exception of the gods, is going to be which means Black. Or people of color, actually. There was no way to thoroughly discern what they meant by the weird head nods and uncomfortable shuffling, which is a testament to how unprepared they were to educate young people of color. And but they said, with the exception of the gods, they wanted what they alluded to be as an all-Black cast. A lot of us didn't know what to make of that. We were like, does that mean that white folks can audition for the gods? Does that mean that non-Black people can audition for the gods? Can they audition for any parts outside of those narratives? That was never made clear, and it was clear that it was not made clear when white students showed up to the auditions knowing that the show was all Black. A number of my classmates made jokes about how they were never going to be cast in this show and how it was just a waste of their time. So they might as well go in an audition and sing a fun song that is definitely appropriate of a Black culture. But it would have been lovely to be in a space where everybody was a person of color and you didn't have to worry about what the implications were of, or the practices that come with white people coming in to audition for a show where they imagine they have to embody some type of Blackness. And that was really disturbing to see a lot of these white students coming in and how they felt like they needed to prepare for auditioning for a Black show. And I was cast as Erzulie, who is one of the gods, the goddess of love, which was a mistake. It should have absolutely been offered to a Black woman. There were a number of Black women attending Pace at the time, who should have been afforded this opportunity, who I respect and admire and would have absolutely loved to execute this role. I later heard that a white student had told another one of my white peers that Bob gave her a personal phone call to explain to her that the reason why she was not cast in the role that I was afforded is because she was white. And I know that she went around telling a number of students that this is what Bob said. I don't know if that's the truth, but even if it weren't true, how are we fostering an environment where it is acceptable to go and within your community of white peers discuss that the only reason why those people get to play those parts is because, well, you know, just like Amy said, you know. And it immediately just completely diminishes the value of what you think you have to offer. You ask yourself all of these questions. Why did they choose me? Was it just because of my ethnicity? Why did they choose me to be in this program? Was it just because of my ethnicity? Who would I be if it weren't for what I look like to these white people? Who would I be if it weren't for the white gaze? Am I good enough? Your perception of your own talent is immediately cheapened by this white perspective, who was a woman who was 2 years older than me too, which is really disappointing. So because Once on this Island takes place in Haiti, all of the characters have a Haitian dialect, and that was going to be exercised in this particular production. We were offered a student dialect coach who came in frequently, and he, you know, with the tools and opportunities he had at the time, he did the best job that he could. And I think a lot of folks were very grateful for him being there to help. I'm sure he wasn't paid as one of the only really speaking roles in the play that was non-Black. I was obviously extremely apprehensive and anxious and uncomfortable with the prospect of having to use a Haitian dialect. In what world is that even remotely acceptable? And separately from my own discomfort, in what world is it acceptable to create an environment where surely your Black peers will feel unsafe and violated by you using a voice that does not belong to you, that belongs to folks who should have been represented in this show? I had no business being there in the first place, let alone occupying this dialect. And in the beginning, I refused. I said, Bob, I can't do this. This is really mind-blowing to me. Thank you for the opportunity. I am grateful. That necessary endurance, right? You have to maintain this idea that I have gratitude. I'm always here and actively ready. However, this is a boundary for me, and I don't think that I can do this in good graces. I can't do this and respect my Black peers. I know that I did harm to my Black comrades in perpetuating this behavior, in agreeing to perform with that dialect, is so shameful. And I know I let those people down. And I know that I actively hurt them. And I know we didn't create a space for them to speak up about it. And that is irreparable harm. And I'll never be able to apologize enough to those people who were bullied into silence the entire time that they were there. The next production that I participated in was a main stage called The Light in the Piazza by Adam Gettle. We would have the artist in residence for that year, Victoria Clark, direct the show. And Victoria had won the Tony for originating the lead role in this production. So it was a massive opportunity. She was just starting to begin her pivot into directing a little bit more. She was still performing on Broadway at the time. We were very anxious. We were very excited. But Piazza was a perfect example. That particular season was a perfect example of what we regard retrospectively as segregated seasons. The two shows that season would be The Light in the Piazza, which was originated entirely by an all-white cast, and Godspell, which historically has incorporated slightly more racial diversity than the general American musical theater canon. But I wasn't necessarily encouraged to audition for The Light in the Piazza, and I know that this was true of all of my peers who were people of color. Meanwhile, quite a few of the white students were being essentially groomed to prepare for this opportunity to audition for Vicki Clark. I never got a heads up. I went in with some material for a supporting character who I felt like I could maybe do some good work with. But fundamentally, I think I imagined that I was going to be in Godspell if I were going to get a performance opportunity. We auditioned for those 2 shows at the same time. So I went in with the Signora Nacarelli sides. And Victoria Clark was very kind and gracious to me. And that night I received a call back for the following day. And I was called back for the lead that Victoria Clark had originated, which was incredibly flattering, but also massively anxiety provoking because this material is so innately complex. I can't think of anyone I know that would be able to turn out that music in one night. I think we had to prepare 2 songs and several pages of dialogue for the callback. That night, I just got to work and I did my very best. Came in the next day. I know I made 1.5 million mistakes because I never anticipated that I would be called in for this role, which is maybe the juiciest role I was ever called back for at Pace. The role is so complex, so deep, so rich. And there was one white student that Amy had in mind that I believe in the casting room, she articulated it was non-negotiable for anybody else to occupy this role. And the work that woman did was phenomenal. I admire her. I respect her as an artist. It was an honor and a massive learning opportunity for me to watch her develop that role. But it's difficult to process as a person of color that Amy was not willing to prepare any of us non-white folks for the chance that we would maybe get called back to play something other than a supporting role. And when Amy was confronted with this, because a number of other students who were non-white were very surprised and shocked by their callbacks, Amy admitted openly that she really didn't anticipate Vicki believing that non-white folks had a space within that show. All of the people on the callback list for cameo roles that either didn't speak or spoke a few lines were comprised entirely of non-white people, with the exception of one white student. However, all of those cameo roles ended up going to white students. So all of those people prepared that material to come in and audition for this role thinking that they had a shot, when in reality, they were just there as a formality to fill out a space for the callback for that particular character, and those opportunities were afforded to white students. Moving forward with the show, I understood that it was one of the most important shows that Pace would put on because of the value of having Vicki Clark there to direct. The school funneled quite a bit of money into this production, more money than I had ever seen in any of my previous experiences, especially in comparison. We were dressed in some of the original costumes from the original Broadway production. Meanwhile, for example, the all-Black show, with the exception of a few non-Black POCs, Once on This Island, was given, I believe, a less than $1,000 costume budget, and it was almost entirely recycled out of trash. And then you had the white students in this Eurocentric show wearing these beautiful period pieces and these period appropriate body shapers to really get us. There was a huge investment in getting us dropped into these characters. External resources that were not afforded to students of color in their productions, in those non-white productions, right? It was on us to do all of that extra work, all of that character work, all of that excavating, because we were assumed to have this expertise of the othered narrative. what is very important to note is that the dialect coaching with the Light in the Piazza was the most comprehensive dialect coaching I ever experienced during my time at Pace. And I was in a number of shows. I believe I had to use at least 6 different dialects during my Pace career. This was the first time I had a professional dialect coach, and the woman that they got, a very lovely woman, Judy Blazer. She's a very highly regarded dialect coach. She actually wrote all of the Italian translations within the published play itself, within the Light in the Piazza itself. So she knew firsthand. She had written these words herself. They had come from her. One of the roles was originally written for her. She is very tied into the show, and we were drilled. We were worked very, very hard to make sure that our accents were going to be as accurate as humanly possible. And we were provided all these external resources. Again, so much time. We went to her own personal home, and every single line we had to speak, we repeated over and over again until she approved it, until each word was perfect. She recorded herself speaking each of our lines. We would check in with her. She would come into our rehearsals. It was a very comprehensive education on how to adopt a dialect in the most authentic way possible. And I find it extremely ironic that the only time that I received those opportunities were to portray a Eurocentric narrative, because they would never ask the white students to be their own resource. So coming out of Piazza, I understood there to be a massive double standard in terms of dialect coaching alone, not to mention production value, resources, money, external directors, funds allocated to fancy Tony Award-winning directors, and costumes, all of these resources that were piled into this one singular show that is a white narrative, compared to the resources that we received within a show like Once on This Island, where the cast was comprised entirely of people of color, and being in a black box that hasn't been cleaned in I don't know how long, and having the costumes at such a low budget and having everything have to be reinvented and literally dressing Black folks in recycled garbage. But it really, what became very clear to me was that it was a priority to maintain authenticity when it came to what was going to be questioned by a white audience. So if a white audience couldn't appreciate the nuances of authentic storytelling that exist within diverse narratives, then there would be no energy or extra effort allocated to those narratives, because at face value, despite its vagueness, white people will still have a good time. And that became very clear to me when I went into my next performance opportunity at Pace, which was immediately following the Light in the Piazza. I participated in what is called the Pace New Musicals, which is when they bring in a few works that are in development from artists that are working in New York and trying to develop their pieces. They come in, they get Pace actors to work on it for them. They do rewrites, we workshop it, we do a presentation at the end of the of winter break. The featured Pace New Musical, the most staged version of the Pace New Musicals, was going to be this show called Great Wall, which is about a Chinese immigrant family and their son, who is very passionate about music. And they are struggling as immigrants to keep their business afloat, to support their child, to combat all of the cultural aspects that come with being a Chinese immigrant in Boston, specifically in this narrative. And I was actually really excited when Amy told me that we were going to do this show, because I felt that I hadn't been able to gain access to a specifically Asian narrative yet. I'd played everything else. And I was excited to finally fall into something where I felt like maybe I could cultivate my own community and I could explore what it is like to portray an Asian person outside of the sex worker that Amy cast me in Dogfight. Unfortunately, there would not be the same number of resources allocated to this particular production. When I was cast as one of the leads, who was the Chinese immigrant mother of the main character. I was very apprehensive about having to use any type of Asian dialect. At this point, I had discovered how uncomfortable it had made me, obviously informed by my experience with Dogfight. And I wanted to play dynamic Asian characters, but I didn't want to have to experience that feeling of trying to bring truth and honor to a narrative that I understand perhaps a little bit more than my white peers, and then to have that be laughed at and to, again, put myself and my own culture at the butt of white comedy. I went to Amy privately. I said, hey, I'd really rather not do this accent. You know, is there a world in which I don't have to do it? And she said, it's an immigrant narrative. You have to do the accent. I said, okay, well, I'm going to need a dialect coach, because I figured that that's how we did this at Pace. I mean, at least with Once on This Island, we had a student coach. I would have been happy to have a student coach. I didn't need them to hire a professional, although that was the standard that was set for a European narrative in just the previous semester in the Light in the Piazza. So I came in believing that this was the standard of approaching dialect coaching. I said, okay, Amy, well, I'm gonna need you to hire a dialect coach. And she said, oh, just talk like your mom. And I responded with, well, Amy, you know, my mom is Korean. And she said, oh, well, white people won't be able to tell the difference. And that was when I fully was able to recognize that I was not there to serve the people that looked like me. I was not there to create art that changed lives for the child version of myself who always craved honest and dynamic and nuanced narratives that represent who we are, and not a version that white people create and imagine us to be like. That was my dream. And in that moment, it became so clear to me that in getting my education at Pace, I was getting an education in how to perform for white audiences. And even if this show will include an Asian cast, even if this will create visibility for underrepresented people, fundamentally who we are making this for is white people. And as long as they can't tell the difference between me and my Chinese peer or my Japanese peer, it doesn't matter, and we're immediately erased. That deep desire for authenticity that I experienced in The Light in the Piazza was completely thrown out the window because we were no longer focusing on whiteness. We came to Amy as human resources to provide her insight as to how other people live and exist. Beyond that, there would never be research done. She directed Great Wall. She never did any research. Throughout the experience, she would ask us, hey, like, how do your parents act when you do this kind of thing? We were there to be the dramaturgs, the dialect coaches, and quite frankly, our own directors. And when she said, white people won't tell the difference, she eliminated the value of our own narratives, of our own truths. And should there be a Chinese person in that audience, which is who this show exists for, should that person be there and say, you know, I'm a little confused because that person's using a vaguely Korean accent that's not even good. Their voice, their opinion doesn't matter, their voice doesn't matter because they do not exist within the white majority, which is what Amy is catering this entire program to. I think it's a lot easier to examine retrospectively, obviously. But
I think, again, that idea of necessary endurance pretty much dictated exactly how I behaved during all of my time at Pace. Because there are so many instances that I know that I don't recall. So one of the ways that I coped was by immediately suppressing a lot of my experiences. And I convinced myself that in order to make it in this business, the general climate of our education was reflected in this idea of the industry is the way that it is. If you're not strong enough to endure it, then go find yourself another job. And you can't change it. So yes, what you do is you diminish the value of your own experience and your own feelings and your own truth. In order to make it out okay, you tell yourself that it's not that bad. And you tell yourself that you go down this like big spiral of like, okay, this thing that just happened to me felt violent, but you know what? Like, it wasn't that bad. I wasn't physically harmed. I am not a complete mess in a puddle on the ground. I have a whole community of people around me. And like, in fact, you're being extended an opportunity. Are you going to express to them that you don't feel grateful for that opportunity? Are you going to be that difficult person? Are you going to make waves in the program? Are you going to condemn yourself to that list of people who they are going to usurp all their whole voice in order to gain more power and further distance themselves from the people who need the greatest amount of representation? So that was definitely a coping mechanism. To the people who perpetuated the violence against the BIPOC community in the Pace BFA in musical theater, it is so shameful that it has taken harming this many people this deeply for you to even listen. You have done irreparable harm to a community that deserved to be celebrated and nurtured and loved and respected. And you wronged each of those people. And stop taking young, beautiful, malleable, impassioned, burgeoning, radiant, brilliant minds into your incapable hands. And promise them that you will arm them with the tools to change the world. You owe those people an apology. You owe them reparations, and you owe it to them to promise that you will not even give yourself the opportunity to harm any more young artists. What you have perpetuated is violence. Because I am no longer existing within the constructs of a white supremacist institution, I have become liberated from the need to impress or placate these white people in power. I have a strong directive now as an artist that has been shaped by my experiences at Pace. And I have a community of brilliant artists who want to share in the new world that we are all committed to creating for one another. And that is how I find healing, and that is how I find hope, is the understanding that all of this is worth it, that all of this work, all of that necessary endurance that each individual had to pursue in order to make it out okay. We are here for each other. We are organized, and that is my source of healing is the burgeoning belief that one day we will all get to share a world that truly celebrates who we are and honestly and respectfully reflects the narratives that we want to offer to the world.